40 years ago, there was pretty much zero electronic technology on a motorcycle. But today, there is a ton, from big displays and traction control, all the way to electronic suspension and quick shifters. I've always been pretty negative about a lot of these things, simply because I couldn't afford them. And it's a polarizing topic across the board. People either love the technology or hate it. But over the last 18 months, I've had the chance to experience a lot of modern electronic tech without having to pay for it. From things like wheelie control all the way to electric windshields.
That's ridiculous.
So today I'm going to share which features I would actually want after testing them and then rank them from F tier down at the bottom all the way to S tier at the top. In theory, every electronic invention was created to solve a problem, right? There are electronics that if you were born in this century, you probably take for granted. There was a time when you would have to change jets on a carburetor if you drastically changed elevation, or even made a slight alteration to your exhaust system. That's because air and fuel used to be mixed through the magic of physics. But these days, we have electronic fuel injection. Little nozzles that spray the perfect amount of atomized fuel into the cylinder. Your bike's brain, or ECU, uses sensors to measure engine conditions and then calculates how much fuel will be needed for the perfect combustion. I have only owned and ridden a handful of bikes with a carb in my lifetime, so this is a tech that I take for granted. But recently, I got to appreciate it because I took my bike down to sea level where the air is significantly more dense than it is where I live at 1,600 meters above sea level. And I didn't have to change a jet. I also removed this restrictive box from my exhaust system and replaced it with a freer flowing link pipe. And since this is a relatively minor change, the bike can automatically adjust itself. That would not have been possible with a carburetor. So fuel injection is S tier in my opinion. I wouldn't want to live without it. You can safely say that fuel injection solved a few problems and made life easier. And yes, I know carb experts will disagree, but just think about us Gen Zs. But was having a physical key a problem? Was looking at analog gauges a problem? Was me doing the rev matching myself a problem? If we're talking motorcycle technology broadly, then we're going to be here all year because things like slipper clutches, perimeter frames, and monoshocks all count as tech. So the rules for this video are simple. Firstly, it has to be electronic technology. And secondly, it has to be sold on the bike. So no aftermarket smart dashes. If you've ever ridden an older bike, you might have been able to ride off with the kickstand still down. And the first time you turned left, pole vaulted yourself off of the bike. Another very real problem, solved by the kickstand kill switch, that kills the engine if you try to put the bike into gear with the kickstand still down. It is an unsung hero and is so cheap that you wouldn't want to leave it behind, placing it in A tier. Now, I'm sure you're aware that upshifting by letting off the throttle, pulling the clutch in, clicking the gear lever up, and then letting the clutch back out and getting back on the throttle wastes so much time, at least in a race scenario, that is. You've probably already guessed that I'm talking about a quick shifter. This strain gauge senses when you activate the gear lever and cuts the ignition for a split second, allowing the gearbox to engage the next gear without the rider having to shut off or pull the clutch in. These days, they're found on just about every bike, but they certainly didn't solve a problem that was very prevalent on the street. But hey, a split second in a race can make all the difference. And these days, quick shifters work on the way down through the gears as well, thanks to an auto blipper. Software that automatically blips your engine to match the speed of the engine to the lower gear, allowing you to clutchless downshift. I was always interested in the idea of a quick shifter. Probably because I knew race bikes had them. But the first bike I ever rode with one was my dad's 2016 R1 back in the day. And it was everything I dreamed it would be. It was like the gear lever was now a button in a video game. However, I was always against the idea of an auto blipper. I thought it would take away from the fun and the skill of rev matching yourself. And it was only a few years later that I got to experience an auto blipper on my own R1. But I fell in love with it, especially on the racetrack. It's addictive and satisfying. But the strange part is that I still enjoy manually rev matching myself. Honestly, I could take or leave an auto blipper depending on the bike.
But I would pay extra for one, so it's only fair that a quick shifter is A tier.
As motorcycle suspension got better and adjustable preload and damping became more common on production bikes, the limiting factor started to become the road surface and the riders rather than the suspension itself. A racetrack is the same every lap for the most part. So if you know what you're doing, you can get a setup that works all the time. But on the road, the surface and conditions can change every day, and the average owner doesn't know enough about suspension to set it up properly. I know I am guilty of this. So what if there was a way to adapt to ever-changing conditions on the fly, and a way to explain to the rider what each setting does without complicated terms, or requiring an imbecile to get a screwdriver out and ultimately making things worse. And that is exactly what electronic suspension brought to the table. And initially, I hated it for another reason than just its immense cost. The consensus from journalists and track bros was that the manually adjustable suspension was actually better on a racetrack than the electronic stuff. And that was enough to get me to side with the old-fashioned stuff, despite never having even tried electronic suspension. But since then, I've been able to test a variety of it. And at first, the only feature I found useful was the rear shock being able to automatically compensate for the added weight of a passenger. Being able to change the damping from road to dynamic on a BMW just felt like a gimmick. It didn't feel like a revelation. But then the new electronic Öhlins on the 2025 Speed Triple changed my mind altogether. I am not a suspension expert, but the front end felt very stiff in my opinion, so I decided to soften it electronically just because I could. And it did feel a lot better to me. Plus, it was easy to do with the clear explanation and the pretty pictures that were easy for my brain to understand. I also think that it is a great way to learn suspension terms and what is possible. For example, I would never go out with a screwdriver and make a lot of manual adjustments. But doing that electronically is just fun. But would I pay extra for it? No. My Speed Triple has the old-fashioned Öhlins and they haven't let me down.
So I would personally place electronic suspension in C tier.
Okay, let's do a few quick inventions now. When riding on the highway for hours on end, your throttle wrist inevitably gets tired. So cruise control was the perfect tech to get adopted. And recently, even adaptive cruise control. But I haven't had the luxury of testing that. Cruise control, to be honest, largely depends on the manufacturer's systems and buttons. For example, MV Agusta's system sucks, but most others are pretty good. It is nice to have, but I could live without it.
Ultimately, B tier.
Apparently, bikers weren't able to tell when their tires went flat, or they were too lazy to use a tire pressure gauge before a ride. Either way, since then, tire pressure monitoring systems of all types have been implemented on some bikes. Personally, I think these are just a gimmick. Perhaps because I've lived without it for so long, so I've already formed the habit of checking my pressures regularly.
E tier. Not worth the extra money for me.
One of the many things that I love about motorcycles is having manually controlled turn signals. But yes, as a result, you will forget to cancel it after making a turn from time to time. So some bikes have an auto-cancelling feature. A feature that I will always turn off immediately because it often feels more dangerous when it cancels your turn signal before you even make the turn.
F tier. A cool idea, but it never works well.
Adjustable windshields on a tourer or an adventure bike make a lot of sense. But even the smartest designs can be a tad dangerous to manually adjust while riding. So we got electric windows like cars.
I'm sure this has been a thing on big tourers for years, but the 1300 GS is the first GS to get it, and it really is a cool gimmick. But as fun as it was, I would not pay extra for it. C tier.
But not all inventions were adopted to solve a problem. At least not a problem I can identify, like keyless ignitions. They make for great marketing material, but that's it. In fact, they create two problems. There's the now common argument of what must I do with my key fob on the racetrack because my leathers don't have a pocket for it. And then you get confused bikes like the Triumph Rocket that has a keyless ignition but then requires a key to unlock the fuel cap. So I would get to a fuel station and have to dig through all of my pockets trying to remember where I left the key because I hadn't needed it all day riding the bike. Then again, I've really grown to love it for everyday street riding on my Speed Triple. I don't wear leathers. It has a keyless fuel cap as well. So when I get home, I don't have to try to remember to take the key out of the bike, something I often forget to do. In fact, the key fob mostly lives in my jacket pocket, since if I'm going to be riding the bike, I will be wearing the jacket anyway. So now having lived with one, I would pay extra for it.
An unexpected A tier if done right.
And in the same vein are TFT displays. I'm not sure what problem they're supposed to solve. They're just technology for the sake of technology. And yet, I am a sucker for a beautiful display. From the second I saw them, I wanted one.
When they have a nice layout, they look brilliant. And the possibilities with graphics are endless. They make altering settings far more intuitive. If done right, that is. Not like my R1. For example, which one of these UIs is easier to understand?
But obviously they add cost to a bike. For example, when I buy crash-damaged bikes to rebuild, these are one of the parts that I want to be intact most of all, because having to replace this is very expensive. I also miss the days when the needles would sweep the gauges when you turn the ignition on in the morning. But then again, I love all the animations that manufacturers come up with TFTs. I also think that a cheap TFT or an LCD pretending to be a TFT looks a lot worse than just regular analog gauges. Ultimately, I'm glad they exist. A while ago, I was looking to buy a BMW XR, and despite journalists agreeing that the first generation XR was actually the sportier bike, I really wanted the second gen just for the modern screen.
So for that silly reason, they have to be A tier.
And finally, as engines got more powerful and technology advanced, the problem of traction could be solved electronically in the form of traction control and ABS. Now, I've always been negative towards these systems because my belief was that if you can't manage these things yourself as a rider, you probably shouldn't be riding a motorcycle anyway. But recently, I figured out why I used to feel that way. It's because the rudimentary systems that I was first exposed to were terrible. Those old systems used to be jarring. Traction control would just cut power altogether, and ABS would shudder uncomfortably. But these days, the systems are so good that they work behind the scenes without you even being able to tell. They make you feel like a pro rider, because unless you saw the lights flickering on the dash, you'd have no idea that those systems were intervening. So you must have got your inputs spot on. And the possibilities are endless with slide control and wheelie control. And as someone who can't wheelie but still enjoys trying, having a system like that as a backup is comforting. Would I pay extra for it? Still not. But it's now a pleasure to have, not a pain in the ass.
So it comfortably goes in B tier.
But I think we can all agree that each of these features have their time and place. So where would you rank each of them?